The photograph was almost 20 years old, but the moment the CEO saw the face inside it, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. It was an ordinary photograph at first glance, a young man standing beneath the golden afternoon sun, holding a little girl in his arms while a woman beside him smiled at the camera. But the CEO knew that face. She had seen it every morning for the last 6 months across the conference table. The same tired eyes. The same quiet expression. The same man who arrived before everyone else, worked until the lights went out, and never once complained. His name was Kieran Vale, a single father who worked in the company's maintenance department. Yet the photograph had been hidden inside an old wooden box belonging to her mother, and when the CEO's mother finally saw it, she turned pale and whispered 5 words that would change all of their lives: "That's him. That's your father." Before we continue, if you believe that kindness can change a person's life and that everyone deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad for more heart-touching stories. Sometimes, one small act of kindness can become the reason someone keeps going. The story began on a bright Tuesday afternoon when 29-year-old CEO Sienna Marlowe was preparing for an important investor meeting at Marlowe Industries. Sunlight poured through the enormous windows of her office, painting long golden rectangles across the polished floor. Her company had grown rapidly under her leadership, but success had made Sienna cautious rather than arrogant. She had learned early that people often hid their pain behind professional smiles. That was why she had quietly noticed Kieran, the maintenance worker who always seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was 38, raising his 8-year-old daughter alone, and somehow managed to work full shifts while attending every school event he could. Sienna had seen him once rushing through the lobby during lunchtime, still wearing his work uniform, holding a small paper bag with a cupcake inside. He had apologized to the receptionist because he was late for his daughter's birthday. 10 minutes later, he was back at work as if nothing had happened. That afternoon, while searching through an old storage cabinet for documents from the company's earliest years, Sienna discovered a small wooden box pushed behind several dusty folders. The box belonged to her mother, Celeste, who had been the company's founder before retiring years earlier. Curious, Sienna opened it. Inside were old photographs, handwritten notes, and faded newspaper clippings. She smiled at pictures of her mother in her younger years, until one photograph slipped from the pile and landed face up on the desk. Sienna stared at it. The man standing beside her mother was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with dark hair, a crooked smile, and unmistakably familiar eyes. Sienna picked up the photograph and studied the date written on the back. It was from 20 years ago. Beneath the date were 3 words written in her mother's handwriting: "The day everything changed." Sienna felt a strange chill move through her. She had never seen this photograph before. Her mother had always told her that her father died before she was born. There had never been a photograph of him in their house, never a story about his voice, never a memory of his hands or the way he laughed. Celeste had simply said that life had been complicated and that some questions were better left unanswered. But now Sienna was looking directly into the face of the man she had spent her entire life believing was gone. Before she could investigate further, Celeste entered the office carrying a cup of tea. She stopped the instant she saw the photograph in Sienna's hand. The color drained from her face. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then her fingers began to tremble. She slowly walked toward the desk, looked at the photograph, and whispered, "That's him." Sienna's heart began pounding. She asked who the man was, but her mother could barely speak. Finally, Celeste admitted that the man in the photograph was Sienna's father, Kieran Marlowe, a young man she had loved before their lives were torn apart by circumstances neither of them knew how to overcome. Sienna demanded to know why she had never been told the truth. Celeste explained that Kieran had disappeared shortly before Sienna was born. She had believed he abandoned them. She had been young, frightened, and furious, and when she heard rumors that he had left town, she convinced herself that he had chosen a different life. But there was something she had never known. A letter had arrived years later, yet it had never reached her. It had been returned to the sender after being sent to an old address. Celeste had never seen it. She had spent decades believing Arlen had walked away, while Arlen had apparently spent decades believing Celeste wanted nothing to do with him. Sienna looked again at the photograph and noticed something that made her stomach drop. Behind Arlen, in the background, stood a familiar brick building. She recognized it immediately. It was the old warehouse that Marlowe Industries had purchased years ago. And suddenly she remembered something else. Kieran, the quiet maintenance worker, had once mentioned that he had worked in that building when he was young. Sienna felt the room spin. She asked her mother whether Arlen had any scars, whether he had a daughter, whether there was anything else she remembered. Celeste looked confused, but Sienna already knew she had to find Kieran. She found him near the loading area just before sunset. He was repairing a damaged cabinet while his daughter, Mira, sat nearby doing her homework. Kieran looked up and smiled politely when Sienna approached. But when she placed the old photograph in front of him, the screwdriver slipped from his hand and struck the floor. His face changed instantly. He picked up the photograph with shaking fingers and stared at it as if he had been transported 20 years into the past. Sienna asked him who the man was. Kieran swallowed hard and said it was his younger brother, Arlen. The answer should have relieved her, but then he turned the photograph over and froze. He saw his own handwriting on the back. Kieran had written the date and the words, "The day everything changed." Sienna realized the impossible truth. Kieran was not her father. He was Arlen's younger brother. But there was still another secret hidden beneath the photograph. Kieran finally explained that Arlen had been his closest family, and 20 years earlier, Arlen had planned to marry Celeste. But before the wedding could happen, Arlen was injured in a serious accident while working at the old warehouse. He survived, but his memory was badly affected. When Kieran went looking for Celeste, he discovered that Arlen had been transferred to another hospital under a different identification record. By the time the truth was uncovered, Arlen was gone. Kieran spent years trying to find him, but every lead disappeared. Eventually, he stopped searching because he had a child of his own and could no longer afford to chase ghosts. Sienna felt tears fill her eyes. She asked whether Arlen was alive. Kieran hesitated. He said he had recently discovered that his brother might still be alive, living in another state under his mother's maiden name. He had been afraid to investigate because every time he opened the past, he found another piece of pain waiting for him. Sienna looked at Kieran and realized something she had never understood before. The man she had watched working quietly in her company was not simply a maintenance worker. He was a man who had spent 20 years carrying a broken family story while raising a daughter, paying bills, and waking up every morning anyway. That evening, Sienna drove with Kieran to the address he had found months earlier but never visited. The sun was sinking behind the trees, filling the sky with orange and pink light. Mira sat in the back seat clutching her father's hand, unaware of the history that was about to unfold. When they reached the small house at the end of a quiet street, Kieran stood frozen beside the car. Sienna could see fear in his eyes. Then the front door opened. An elderly man stepped outside. Kieran stopped breathing. The man was older, thinner, and his hair was almost completely gray, but the eyes were the same. The eyes from the photograph. The eyes Sienna had spent her entire life wondering about. Arlen stared at Kieran for several seconds before whispering his name. Kieran walked forward slowly, tears streaming down his face. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then they embraced like two brothers who had been separated for only a day instead of 20 years. Sienna watched from a few feet away, crying silently as she realized that some people do not stop loving each other just because life keeps them apart. Arlen eventually turned toward Sienna. He looked at her face and immediately understood. He asked if she was Celeste's daughter. Sienna nodded. Arlen covered his mouth with one trembling hand. He had spent years believing Celeste had moved on without him. He had never known that she had raised their daughter alone. He had never known that Sienna had grown up asking where her father was. And Celeste had never known that he had spent years trying to find his way home. The reunion between Arlen and Celeste happened 2 days later. Sienna brought her mother to the same house. When Celeste saw Arlen standing in the doorway, she dropped her purse. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Celeste walked toward him, touched his face with trembling fingers, and began to cry. There was no anger left in her expression, only 20 years of grief finally being released. Arlen apologized for the years they had lost. Celeste apologized for believing he had abandoned her. Neither apology could erase the past, but both finally gave the past somewhere to rest. Sienna thought the story ended there, but the most important change happened afterward. She offered Kieran a promotion to facilities manager, but he initially refused because he did not want anyone to think he had received special treatment. Sienna told him it was not charity. She had watched him work harder than anyone around him, arrive early, stay late, and raise his daughter with dignity. She said he had earned the opportunity long before she knew who his brother was. Kieran accepted the position with tears in his eyes. Months later, Sienna walked through the company lobby during a warm summer afternoon and saw Kieran teaching Mira how to ride a bicycle outside the building. Arlen and Celeste were sitting nearby, laughing together like people who had finally been given permission to enjoy life again. Sienna stood by the window and smiled. For years, she had believed that success meant building something bigger than yourself. Now she understood that real success was sometimes much quieter. It was helping someone find their way home. It was giving a tired father a chance to breathe. It was refusing to judge a person by the uniform they wore or the position printed on their employee badge. And sometimes, it was simply finding an old photograph at exactly the right moment. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes that broken families can heal, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Your support helps us bring more stories of hope, kindness, sacrifice, and second chances to people who may need them. And before the story ends, I have one special request: comment "second chances" below if you believe it is never too late for forgiveness, family, and a new beginning. Because Kieran learned something that afternoon that none of them would ever forget. Sometimes life takes away 20 years, sometimes it leaves scars that never completely disappear, but kindness can still open a door that pain kept closed. Arlen lost 20 years with his family, Celeste lost 20 years waiting for an explanation, and Sienna lost 20 years wondering what her father looked like. Yet when they finally stood together beneath the warm evening sun, they realized something beautiful. They could not change yesterday, but they could choose what to do with tomorrow. And for the first time in decades, nobody was walking away. They were walking home together.